Hi, today I'd like to introduce you to MultiTables and SubTables in Analytica. These features enable you to present the end user of your model with input tables that are structured differently from the input variables in your model. When you design a model, it's a good practice to separate different quantities into different variables. Doing so leads to models that are more elegant, transparent, understandable, maintainable, and efficient. But in a user interface, it may be better to group different quantities together in a single table, so that the user can deal with all the parameters of a particular situation in a single view. These conflicting objectives can leave a model builder with a tough choice. Should you go with the elegant model structure with a less convenient user interface, or sacrifice the elegant model structure to have your heterogeneous inputs in a single input table? With a multi-table, you can have it both ways. A multi-table shows the user multiple input tables in a single virtual view. In fact, it can also include computed results in the same table as non-editable cells. So you can preserve good model style with separate variables for separate quantities while presenting them in the user interface in a single table. The opposite problem also arises. Sometimes you have large data sets that have a simple structure, so the elegant model consists of just a few variables and indexes. But the amount of data or dimensionality of the data would be overwhelming from a user interface point of view. It's better for the user interface to focus on a subset, subdimension, transformation, or some particular filtering of your data. A subtable accomplishes this without requiring you to compromise on the simplicity of your model structure. Now I'd like to start a new model where I can demonstrate these ideas. So I'm going to have data indexed by country. And so I'll create this indexed as a list of labels, and I'll start by copy-pasting in the names of the countries in the Americas. Next, I'm going to have variables for population, for gross domestic product, and for jobless rate. These will all be indexed by country. Population will be in millions of people, so we'll put the units to millions of people. And GDP will be in US billions of dollars. Okay, and now let's set the definition of each of these to a table indexed by country. And I'll just copy and then paste. Okay, now that we have the tables created, I can go ahead and open the edit table for population, and I can enter a population for Argentina. Alright, and then I can close this table, and then I can go over and open the table for GDP and enter GDP for Argentina. Alright, now from a user interface point of view, it'd be nicer if I'm entering data for Argentina if all those are in the same table. But when I'm writing formulas, having these all separate variables is kind of nice because I can refer to them by name. So if I'm creating a, say, per capita GDP, then I can use the identifiers GDP divided by population directly in the definition. That makes it very convenient. What I'm going to do now is to create a multi-table, and I'm going to call it economic data. I'm going to need a new index to index the things that I'm going to include in the multi-table. So I'll call that economic indicator, and I'll define the index as a list. I need 3 items in there for population, GDP, and jobless rate. And right now these are just serving as labels. Now I can define economic data to be a multi-table on this index, economic indicators index. Okay, so let's open the multi-table, and right now it has zeros in it, it's empty. Up here on the control on the right hand side, you can see that we're in meta expressions view. This is where we tell it what we want to include in this multi-table. Here we're going to put the identifiers of the edit tables in each of these cells. Now let's go to show cells view. Here you can see the data. In fact, we're going to pivot. Here you see the data that I entered previously for Argentina. It's there. I'll enter some for Bolivia. Let's close the multi-table and go look at the edit table. Okay, so here in the GDP edit table, you can see that the data I just entered is there in the original table. If I enter something for Brazil here in the edit table, go back to the multi-table, we should see it there. See it? Okay. So when we're changing data in the multi-table, we're actually changing the original data in the edit table. The multi-table is just a virtual view of those edit tables. I'm going to copy paste the numbers for all of these countries in the Americas. Let's go look at populations edit table, and you're going to see that all that data is in fact in there as expected. And what I want to do now actually is expand this model to include the countries of Asia. So I go to the end of the index and I can just paste in the names of the countries from Asia. So what I have now is that the second half of the index contains the Asian countries. The first half of the index contains the countries from the Americas. Now in my tables, like population here, I have data for the first half of the countries and no data for the Asian countries. I'd like to leave it like that. But right now my problem is that there's just too many countries. I'd rather have it so that the user can focus on one region at a time, either the Americas or Asia. So what I'm going to do is create a subtable. And first I'm going to define the regions by creating an index called region. I'll make it a list of labels and make it the Americas and Asia. And I'll need a mapping to map the countries to this region. Now, I have a little trick when I do mappings. I like to turn on the cell defaults attribute and define a default for the table. So the cell default, I'm going to make a choice among the possible regions. This will make each cell in the mapping be a choice function. Now I'm going to make the actual mapping be a table from country to region. And you can see here they all start out with choice pull downs where you can select the region of each country. But right now everything's set to the Americas. So I'm going to find the beginning of Asia here, and that would be Afghanistan. Change it to be Asia. Shift click to select it. Copy. I need to shift click, copy, and then select all the cells to the bottom and paste. Now the second half are set to Asia. So now we have a mapping from country to region. The next step is I want to allow the user to select what region they're going to be focused on. So here is a variable for selected region. I'm going to make it a choice as well among the regions. And then I'm going to create an input node for that so the user can easily select what region they want to focus on. So then I want to use this selected region to create a subset of the countries that the user is going to focus on. These are the selected countries. So it's the subset where the country's region is equal to the selected region. If we evaluate that, here you can see it's the Americas. If we change the selection to Asia and look at the result, you can see it's the Asian countries. So now I'm ready to define the subtable. So I'll do this in a variable. We'll name it, say, regional econ data. And of course, I'm going to define that as a subtable. Now for the parameter of the subtable, we need to take an existing table, in this case a multi-table, it could be another subtable also, economic data, and we're going to use a subscript expression to pull out a subset of that table or a transformation of the table. So here we're going to take the countries that are in the selected countries subset. Okay? So that's what a subtable expression looks like in expression view. When we enter it, it turns into a button, and here we can see it. Let's pivot to put it this way. Okay, and so what you're seeing now is we're looking at the countries of Asia in the table. I'm going to scroll down here. Let's put some data in here. Let's enter the population for Afghanistan. Now let's go look at the edit table for population and scroll down to where Afghanistan is. And notice that the data is in there. Okay, so it made it all the way back to the original table, even though this was a subtable of a multi-table. So I'm going to go ahead and copy paste in the data for all the Asian countries now. So now we have data for all the countries in here. If I go back to the Americas, that data is still in there. We're viewing only the Americas, and so you could easily change this data if you wanted. The user can focus on one region at a time. So what I'd like to do now is to add a computed column to this table. So let's go over to the index and make room for that computed column. And in fact, I'll put in per capita GDP. So let's go back to our multi-table and tell it what's going to show in that column. Currently says 0. It's gray, meaning it's non-editable. Okay. So we have to go to meta expressions to tell it what to put in here. And so if you put a computed expression in here, it'll show that. And 0 is actually considered to be an expression. So that's actually computing 0. That's why it's read-only. So let's go GDP divided by population, and let's divide by 1,000 because GDP is in billion and population is in million, and actually times 1,000, so that we can put that in dollars per person. Okay. So now if we look at the cells, there's the actual computed GDP per capita, or per capita GDP, and it's gray because it's computed and not editable. Remember we created a variable for per capita GDP earlier? So we should be able to just use the result of that variable instead of recomputing it in an expression here. So let's put the variable in here. Now if we put the name of the variable in here, that looks like what we did when we specified what edit table we want to display. And indeed, that's going to say we want to be able to edit the definition of that value. And so we're seeing its definition in there. And I made a mistake. We need the times 1k in there. So I'll fix that here. That's changing the actual definition. And you can notice that every single cell was actually showing me a virtual view of that same definition because that variable is not indexed by country. Okay? But we don't want to see the definition here. If I look at the result, that would actually be the right thing. See, in the result view, it's in fact evaluating that definition, and we are in fact seeing the computed per capita GDP in the result. But in the multi-table, I don't want to see the definition, I want to see the value. So the way you do that is you surround it by mid, which says I want to see the mid value of this variable. Okay. Once you do that, go back to the cell view, and now we're seeing the actual computed value. One of the nice things about using a variable instead of an expression is that we can set the number format and it's associated with that variable, and so with the column of the multi-table here. Now let's change the GDP in one of the cells and watch how the computed value changes. So I change the number here, and then I have to click the green checkbox, and as soon as I click the green checkbox, the computed values update. So the computed column here actually depends on the cells in the table. I can change 2 cells here and then click, and it will wait until the green check to compute all of those cells. Now I'm going to show you a secret trick for how I can configure this table to proactively evaluate the computed column without having to press the green check. To do this, I press F12 to open the TypeScript window. In this TypeScript window, I set an attribute called proactively evaluate, and I put the name of the table view, economic data, and I set it to 16. So now watch carefully what happens when I change the cell. Keep your eye on the right column over there. As I change the number in the cell and I enter that cell, the number on the right changes immediately. So it's recomputing per capita GDP anytime I make a change. Another thing that I don't like right now the way it is that my country index has all the Americas followed by all the Asian countries. Notice Argentina at the top, you have to scroll down, then suddenly you see the Asian countries at the bottom. I want to sort the countries by name. I'm going to do that in TypeScript also. Here I'm going to say country is equal to the sort index of country. So this will sort country alphabetically. Let's look at the table again here, and now you can see actually all the A's are up there. Afghanistan and Argentina are there together. And it kept the number for population correctly associated with each country. So everything is still good. Okay, it reshuffled all the table data in all the views of the table. So Argentina still has the population that it initially had, and so even though it reordered all the countries. and it's there for Asia. Now we need to complete our user interface by making an input node for our subtable here, and so that the user can easily get to the subtable and select the region in a user interface by pressing the subtable button. Okay, and now the final thing will be to put all the UI logic in a module so it's not cluttering up the core logic of our model. So all these nodes here that we used to put together the multi-tables and subtables go in this module. And finally, I like to turn off the arrows going into a UI module. And there we have it. I would like to now show you another model, one that I've already put together, that demonstrates multi-tables again. This one has a multi-table here where you can select a distribution for each quantity. For example, quantity 1 is using a triangular distribution, and the multi-table here shows the parameters that the triangular distribution wants you to enter. If I were to switch that to be a normal distribution, the labels change to show that it wants a mean and a standard deviation. And I can enter those if I want to. Okay, I could change it to be a triangular again, or a uniform distribution, or any of the distributions listed here. And each of these here, notice there's only one distribution, and the other parameters are grayed out, showing they're not applicable to this choice of distribution. Now this multi-table is actually changing the edit tables in each of these 5 parameters here: center param, rate param, lower param, upper param, and spread param. And the distribution type is stored in this variable here. So if I open its edit table, you can see it actually has all the choice pull downs. This chance node is used to actually generate the chosen distribution for Monte Carlo. So for example, if you look at it, here are the CDF plots for the 10 assessed quantities. Okay, how does that work? Well, if we look at the edit table for it, it's actually a determ table, and it shows that for each possible distribution type, here's the formula that's used. So uniform is going to use the lower and upper param, normal is going to use the center param and the spread param, triangular is going to use the lower param, the center param, and the upper param, and so on. So now let's look at the details of the multi-table of the UI. So I'll go into the UI. Here are the nodes that were used to put this together. Assessment is the multi-table. So let's start by looking at its meta expression view. So in edit mode here, we can select meta expressions. And I'm going to just pivot so we can look at these easier. So distribution type contains the pull down, remember, for the type of distribution. And then the mid value here is computing the labels for each of the parameters. So let's see what that looks like. For example, the first label, we're going to look at param1 name, and you can see it's a determ table also. It says in each of the possible distribution types, here is the label for the first parameter, and I've just filled that in. For the second parameter, same idea, except where it's inapplicable, I've just put empty strings. And in the third parameter, same thing. The only distribution that has a third parameter is a triangular distribution. Okay, let's go back and look at the meta expressions again. Okay, now for the actual parameter values, you can see it's a little more complicated here. This is actually doing a subtable-like thing. It's saying it's going to take the values out of a table called all param values, and which one's it going to take? Well, param1 source is going to tell it which value to use. Okay, so let's start by looking at param1 source. That's right here. So right here, basically, for each distribution type, it shows which of the 5 input variables are going to be used for the first parameter. So for example, uniform is going to use the lower parameter. You know, it could be any of these input parameters that I showed you earlier. Okay, exponential is going to use the rate parameter for its first parameter. Normal is going to use the center parameter. Okay, and parameter 2 is the same idea, except that It has some nulls in here where there is no second parameter, but the other ones are showing a normal is going to use the spread parameter, for example. So this variable here, all parameter values, is also a multi-table, and you can see it actually has all of the input parameter variables in one table. Okay, so here's the actual values for all of those. Remember, for each quantity, only some of these are used. So if quantity 1 is a triangular, it's like only the lower, the center, and the upper are actually used in that distribution. But this has all 5 variables, so it stores more than it needs. The actual meta expression here, as you can see, it's a multi-table, and it's just listed which variable is going to be used in each column. Okay. So going back to this meta expression again, where we had the subscript in there, this is saying take the table, all parameter values that had all of the inputs together, and use the parameter that is computed by parameter 1 source, that variable I showed you. So that's actually changing which input variable is going to appear in that cell each time. So study that a while and it'll become clear. Okay, and so the thing that's kind of neat here is that this parameter right here, when I change it, I'm changing the variable that's named lower parameter. Is that what it was called? Lower param, right? So, okay, so I'm changing the variable that's called lower param. But when I switch this to normal, I'm changing the variable that's called center param, right? And when I change it to exponential, I'm changing, this is the variable rate param. So depending on what's selected here, this cell actually maps to a different input variable. So this is a fairly advanced example, but it shows you what is possible. For more information on multi-tables and subtables, visit the Analytica wiki. Type in MultiTable into the search box, and that will take you to the MultiTable reference page. As you can see, there's quite a lot of information here. Also, in the search box, type SubTable, and that will take you to the SubTable reference page. Once again, quite a lot of information on use of subtables. And finally, there is a webinar on subtables that was done a while back. So if you go to the front page of the wiki, find archives of previous webinars, and find the subtables webinar. That webinar is about an hour long. It was done during the Analytica user group, and that'll give you one more thing to watch. So try them yourself and enjoy multi-tables and subtables.